professor of theology at Moody for over 7 years. He was previously a student at Moody before going on to receive his PhD in systematic theology from Wheaton College. Among other things, his areas of research include theology of land and theological descriptions of race. So if you could join me in welcoming Dr. Varma.
So I'm immediately described as a tree hugger and a race baiter.
There's worse.
There might be worse. I don't know. It's good to see so many of you here. Some familiar faces, some not as, but it's good to see you all. I was given a long period of time to be able to do this. I'm definitely not going to use all that time, as I said to Brandon. I have prepared remarks that I will spend maybe 30, 35 minutes reading, but then I'd love for it to be a conversation after that. So if I say something that irritates you, feel free to let me know, and I don't think I'll get mad. And if I say something that makes you happy, you can let me know that as well. Some of this, if you've been in my classes, might sound familiar, so apologies to you. And those who've never been in my classes, maybe you have good reason to stay away now. All right, so I'm entitling this, "The Rocks Shall Cry Out." Why not the dust too? And I'd like to open with 3 quotations that I'm not necessarily going to unpack in a direct way, so much as I think you'll see why I'm using these three references I make throughout. So the first one, and this is not meant to be some sort of order, right? Especially the 2 references I make that'll be from the Bible are not in biblical order. I think that's okay. So the first one is Acts chapter 2, verse 2, 4 through 6. "Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now they were staying in Jerusalem, God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard the sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard their own language being spoken. Listening to wild places, we are audience to conversations in a language not our own." I take that from Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a botanist, in a book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which if you've heard of that, hopefully you love it, and if you haven't heard of it, I highly recommend it. And then the final one from Luke chapter 19, verses 39 to 40. "Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, 'Teacher, rebuke your disciples.' 'I tell you,' he replied, 'if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out.'" From the moment of birth, children begin the amazing journey towards speech. The process, frankly, remains a mystery to us all, even the most dedicated of researchers. Fresh to the smells, sights, and sounds of the world, most babies simply offer the most basic of speech, the utterance of cries. And if you've been around babies long enough, you start to realize the cries really are speech. You can begin to distinguish kinds of cries. You know which cries mean "I can do something about it," and which ones mean "there's nothing I can do. Get the child to mommy. She's the only one who can do anything about it." theological account of that. Walter Brueggemann has a book called Land, where he goes into some of this stuff, and he's drawing from others as well. When we refer to outer space, perhaps we get excited in our awe of the stars and the countless mysteries of the universe. But at the same time, we conceive of space itself as nothing in particular. Outer space is the infinite void of nothing between the stars that intrigue. Perhaps we are intrigued too by the mystery of what we perceive to be the nothingness of space between the stars, but in itself that mysterious space is cold and lifeless to us. We perceive it from a distance, precisely because the senses of proximity, touch, taste, and smell, are rendered useless by the nothingness of the free and generic space between the stars, which we see as the same between our sun and Polaris as it is between the Andromeda and Pegasus galaxies. By contrast, place is full of meaning. A place is what it is precisely because of our proximal connection to it. It means something to us because we touch, taste, and smell it in a way that bears on our lives. We tend not to view exotic other worlds, even on our own planet, in the way that we do our own homes. The place over there, say New Delhi, India, is meaningful to us because of our ability to relate it to ourselves. We see it and perhaps hear it in documentaries. And we think we know it because we codify it according to our categories, which are based upon what we have touched, tasted, and smelled in our place. As Wallace Stegner puts it, at least to human perception, a place is not a place until people have been born in it, have grown up in it, have lived in it, known it, died in it, have both experienced and shaped it as individuals, families, neighborhoods, and communities over more than one generation. It is made a place only by slow accrual, like a coral reef. Jennifer Allen Craft continues the thought. She says, places are made, therefore, through relationships, through social interactions that shape both the community and physical place in relation to each other. I would add that these relationships necessarily take for granted the earth itself, to which we belong and with which we have an actual relationship that shapes our basic perceptions and interactions. The earth both bears our construals of meaning as the collection of places in which we breathe and live, and it also shapes our meaning in the form of the givenness that we assume in order to breathe and live. We learn our way in the world. However we might conceive the idea of world within our basic presumptions of sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. Our being in places is the condition that gives meaning to the languages we learn to improvise. So when I make this point of sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell, I'm working especially off implicitly the late French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, where he points out that one of the problems of the modern world is that we base everything on sight and hearing, which are senses of distance, as opposed to senses of proximity. Right? You have to be close to something to touch it, to taste it, to smell it. And if we remove those as important indicators of knowing something, then we miss something intimate about the process of knowing and being. So I'm working off of that assumption when I'm using these terms. Our lives exist in the intersection of words and places, for we are communicative beings taken from the dust of the ground, who live in a communicative world, and who are brought into being by a communicative God, who began it all with a simple, let there be. Places and words are intimately connected. We know places through our acquaintance with the language or languages of a place, and we know each other within those places through our shared or differing tongues. These languages are those of people, but also of the earth itself. When we lose the connection between place and words, we are doomed to do violence to both people and the earth. Before turning to the violence, though, we should first turn to what we take for granted. People belong in places. From the dust of the ground. Often seen as two tablets of creation, Genesis 1 and 2 present two different yet complementary accounts of creation. Genesis 1 provides a genealogy of creation moving from heaven to earth, which you see in Genesis 1:1, while chapter 2, particularly beginning in verse 4, moves from the earth to the heavens. As biblical scholar Richard Bauckham notes, the biblical creation account, quote, follows primarily a spatial rather than a chronological arrangement. Now, I know we've been accustomed to see things differently because we see days, but I want to quote a prominent biblical scholar just so you can see that I'm not making this up. While he's referring primarily to Genesis 1, I wish to extend his observation to the entirety of the Genesis creation narratives. Indeed, the Bible in general persistently sees heaven as the abode of God, while the earth is the abode of humanity. Heaven and earth are spatial terms, and the Bible seems interested in narrating them as places within and between the stories of God's movements of love and creation's multifaceted toil. The first tablet of creation is the account of God's movement from his abode into his formation of the abode of humanity. So the account fittingly culminates in the creation of the creatures of the earth as bearers of the image of the Heavenly Father on and in the earth. The parallels of the 6 days of creation further clarify the movement. Days 1 and 4, 2 and 5, and 3 and 6 parallel each other, where the first day is in the couplets presents creation through separation. For example, light from darkness, water from firmament, water from land. While the second day of the couplets narrates God's formation of places and population amid the same realms. So celestial bodies, fish and birds, animals and humans. The final description is the creation of humanity to be creatures of the earth alongside animals. But the special commission to humanity is to be the presence of God in the earth and amid the creatures of the earth. Humanity was made to be God's image. Meanwhile, the second tablet takes up the task of describing the place of humanity, specifically the work of making places and doing so around the presence of God. Humanity was to be a species of priestly gardeners and caretakers, cultivating life in the earth encircled around the tree of life, which sat in the middle of the garden. That life was a life of promise and nourishment. And the tree, the fruit of God's lips joined with the fruit of the earth to be a source of life in its fullest for all the creatures of the garden. Physical and spiritual nourishment were one in that tree at the center of the garden. The earth received its life from God and was sustained in that life by God's life-giving presence in her midst. Humanity's priestly task was to direct all of creation to its fullness in God by encircling it around his place of joining. Humanity was perfectly equipped to the task, for humanity was a creature of the dirt, yet received its life from the very breath of God himself. See Genesis 2:7. Of course, tragedy enters the tale in Genesis 3, where creation is undermined by the priestly humans enclosing creation around the false promise, the lie of the serpent, which brought death. All of creation suffers because the one who belonged to the earth betrayed the earth. The place of life in the presence of God became the place of shame and hiding. The whole earth felt the effect, for her own priest and caretaker enclosed her around death. The same space teeming with life was now the site of 2 places. The possibility of life through the joining of the earth and the abode of God, the heavens, and the new reality of death through the separation of the earth from God's presence. An act equally fit for judgment and mercy, God bars the path to the possibility of life. The earth was no longer fit, for the time being, to occupy the place of life. With the fall of humanity goes the fall of the earth, because the two belong together. Humanity belongs to the dust of the ground, but now facing toward death, humanity will lose its life and dissolve back merely into the earth, devoid of the breath of God. The biblical story only just begins with the fall, though. Throughout the pages of the Bible, the people of the earth and the life of the earth remain intertwined. In Genesis 3, the earth is cursed with humanity. In Genesis 4, the earth is stained with the blood of Abel, and thus protests by refusing to yield crops to Cain. In Genesis 6, humanity becomes so horrific that days 3 and 6 of creation must be undone. According to 1 Peter 3, baptized, right? And if you follow the imagery of baptism in the New Testament, baptism is distinctly linked with death. So creation must be undone as the waters submerge the earth in all its life. Throughout the rest of the Old Testament, wild beasts signal echoes of the loss of Eden. foreshadowing a renewal where the wolf and the lamb and the lion and the calf rest together. See Isaiah 11:6. God provides an image of a new Eden in the giving of a land flowing with milk and honey to a new humanity, the people of his covenant through whom he will bring redemption. Yet in their disobedience, they too were sent out of the land and away from the presence of God. Indeed, as Jesus, the last Adam, meaning person of the dirt, proclaimed in Luke chapter 19, the rocks cry out. Humanity and the earth belong together, so much so that Revelation culminates in the image of a new Eden with a new tree of life nourishing the creatures of the earth. And the text is very deliberate to speak of not just human nourishment. In the contemporary world, our imaginations are not shaped toward awareness of our being creatures who belong to the earth. Nevertheless, our daily lives demonstrate this reality. Our lives are characterized by technologies that obscure the dependence. We mostly live and work in buildings with climate control systems that keep our bodies in relatively narrow bands of atmospheric conditions. We traverse space primarily in automobiles, hovering over the earth and with their own climate controls. We board public transportation, walk through cities, wearing headphones and earbuds that block our auditory connection to our places. Our food travels great distances by land, air, and sea before reaching sanitized supermarkets with more climate control. As Robin Wall Kimmerer laments, peering across the fields from her front porch, she, quote, reads across that hill a story about people who value uniformity and the efficiency it yields, a story in which the land is shaped for the convenience of machines and the demands of a market. She continues, in indigenous agriculture, the practice is to modify the plants to fit the land. As a result, there are many varieties of corn domesticated by our ancestors, all adapted to grow in many different places. Modern agriculture, with its big engines and fossil fuels, took the opposite approach, modified the land to fit the plants, which are frighteningly similar clones. In this process, she laments, quote, relationships disappear and individuals are lost in anonymity. You can hardly recognize a beloved face lost in a uniformed crowd. Kimmerer here is thinking of the relationship between plants, specifically corn, bean, and pumpkin plants. She later extends her focus to the loss of relationship between people and the plants of the earth too. Indeed, she begins her chapter observing the disconnect between people and their food, noting a subsequent disinterest in the sustenance that we functionally assume simply comes from the supermarket. What Kimmerer is describing is what I will later refer to as the McDonald's effect. So Wendy, that came back from earlier. Yet the fact remains that we are creatures of the earth. Our food, from wherever it comes, is the fruit of plants, the meat or eggs of animals, or an often disturbing factory combination of both through processing. Our growth from womb onward depends upon nourishment from the earth. Our muscles gain their strength from the protein in the food and the gravity of the earth, their energy from the sugar in plants, and their health from the vitamins and nutrients in the sun's rays and the earth's soil. In other words, we quite literally are what we eat. Despite the environmental systems of buildings and cars, the air we breathe is the air that permeates the earth, a living sign of the spirit that hovered over the deep and filled the lungs of the first gardeners and first apostles. Our skin bears the marks of the soil in which our ancestors experienced differing intensities of the light and heat of the sun. Our fingernails bear the dirt of the earth that we grasp in our hands. Our bodies take their form at least partially from their terrain. People of the mountains have thicker and stronger thighs. Farmers have stronger arms and hands, while ocean dwellers have bleached hair. Now test me on this one. Anyone here from more mountainy regions, Colorado? Look around, and not to be creepy about it, but be kind of subtle and look around, and they have thick thighs.
I'm gonna go.
Now this isn't a negative thing. Relatively, right? I don't mean like. I mean you have to pay attention. But the idea at play here is that people's legs are fit to their terrain.
Okay.
Right? I don't mean this in some sort of obscene way of, man, you can't notice anything but thighs, right? But just pay attention. Sure. Our cultures are constantly changing ways of life in tune with particular places, and its particular people. Indians beget Indians in more than genetic ways. Yet Indians of the village beget Indians with different sensibilities than Indians of the city, who are different from Indians in diaspora in the United States. The same can be said of Puerto Ricans. American soil and its places provide new earth in which to learn how to be Indian and Puerto Rican, as do the interactions of Indians and Puerto Ricans on American soil. We bear customs born of the joining of places, taking customs that reflect local practices into new places, new soil, thereby creating new ways to be in the earth that are both true to the soil that bore us and to the soil of the place in which we set new roots. There is perhaps no better image of this exchange than language, for we are creatures of language who become audience to people and places, and the earth each with their own languages. In the words again of Kimmerer, we become, quote, audience to conversations and language not our own. Name the animals. Contemporary philosophers have noted that language only works for communication because it enables the formation of shared ideas on the basis of generalities that create common expression. For example, take the word apple. Apologies to those who've been in my classes. I've heard too much about apples. For speakers of English, the apple is so basic to our perception of the world that we rarely think twice before qualifying it. We simply say things such as, I love apples, or I hate apples, or buy some apples at the store. In fact, whereas we might qualify something much less basic to our lives, such as, I like action movies, but not romantic comedy movies, or I can tolerate salmon, but have no interest in catfish. We usually do not think twice about the simple designation apple. No one would assume that I hate apples would be a way of denouncing a group of people. Yet as I learned early in my marriage, a lot more is taken for granted in the simple designation apple than my wife or I realized. One day she sent me to the grocery store with a list, and atop the list was apples. As a child, my mother bought Red Delicious, Granny Smith, and Golden Delicious apples. And by my late 20s, I had firmly settled upon a preference. I had had other apples, but in my mind, the choice was rather clear. In the store, I would look for the Red Delicious apples and then move on to the next item on the list. Now, I know that's controversial. I know people don't like them. I do. That's all I'm saying. I like them. I do not recall even noticing other comments. My childhood, my family had formed the language of apple in a specific way. When I returned home, my wife was appalled at my decision to bring those, quote, spongy things into the house. A decade later, I still don't know what that means, but I hear a lot of yeahs when I say that. Yeah, sure, I still don't know what that means. For my Canadian wife, born in a different place, in different family and country, Red Delicious was not remotely on her radar. She wanted pink ladies. I didn't even know what a pink lady was before I met her. As far as I thought, maybe that was a way to denigrate someone. I don't know. Yeah. Again, I looked up. Where was I? Oh yeah, rest assured that the simple designation apple did not appear on a list for a long time thereafter. A second example will solidify the point. More on apples. For several years, I taught on a summer study abroad program that took primarily Euro-American college students to Italy, Switzerland, and Germany for 2 months of immersive learning. In Germany, we stayed in a youth hostel, and every morning we would begin the day together with an open breakfast. Among the offerings was a bowl full of fruit. Many students were accustomed to eating fruit with their breakfast, but were thoroughly bewildered at the offerings before them in the hostel. Rather than the waxed, rotund, symmetrical apples that American chain grocery stores sell, the students encountered small, asymmetrical, unwaxed apples with skin blemishes. Rather than juicy and sweet, the German apples had a much more subtle taste to them. I had one German student for whom everything seemed in order, but the American students could be heard complaining, "What kind of apples are these?" In both examples, apple turned out to bear far more meaning than it initially seemed. For all of its ability to present a general category, the word apple gained meaning only insofar as it connected to people in their places. Apart from its connection to places, apple means little more than snow does to one who grows up in the Sahara, and heat does to the Alaskan. The ideas of apple, snow, and heat bear little meaningful significance apart from life in places. We receive a hint of this joining of language and place in Genesis 2, where God tells Adam to name the animals. Actually, the situation is more enigmatic, for God first reflects that it is not good for Adam to be alone, and then tells him to name the animals. While the text does not reveal the names that Adam provided, given the close connection between language and place, we can begin to understand the divine rationale. As a gardener and a caretaker of the animals, Adam knew Eden as his home, the way that a gardener or zoologist knows her place today. Naming generally reflects some sort of intimate acquaintance, for it says something about the person or thing being named relative to the ones doing the naming. As caretaker, a degree of intimacy between Adam and the animals is taken for granted. His act of naming took place amid the type of acquaintance with the animals that taught him about companionship. He experienced the intimacy that a hippo shared with another hippo, yet could not with him. He saw that for all his familiarity, none of the animals could take his own name. After this exercise teaches him what he is missing, God gives him, quote, bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh. Adam names her from his intimate understanding of his position within his place. She is like him in a way that the rest are not. Not surprisingly, they are then together to fill the place and serve it as gardeners and caretakers. Word and place belong together, and people are creatures of both. The rocks will cry out. So what happens when people and words lose the significance of their birth from places and earth? What happens when people forget that ideas are born out of places rather than supervene over those places? What happens when people miss that ideas are generalities that are communicative shorthand for those practices, discursive practices, and encounters born of and taking place in the earth? Modern history is marked by colonialism, where the normalcy of one place and its ideas, language, and practices born of their earth impose itself as the universal mark of civilization upon another. The nature of universal claims is the removal of all local specificity. It is communication in generalities. The essence of the apple, that is, what joins competing local understandings of apples, is the idea that is simultaneously no particular apple at all, and the core, pun intended, of what unites all apples. Sorry, Shreya. Sorry again. The problem here is The problem here is not that we have the language of apple that enables communication. Rather, the problem is the forgetfulness that none of us become acquainted with or know apple independently of the particular apples that we encounter. The generalities of language helpfully enable communication, but when we are hungry, we want an actual physical apple. That physical apple, no less than our stomachs, has no real interest in universal general claims. The truthfulness of the apple is in the particular apple before us that can satisfy our hunger. In colonialism, though, the idea of the apple reigns. But as we have seen, the idea is nothing other than the image of an apple that belongs to one group of people in one place. Yet that people has forgotten that their particularity has shaped their understanding of the universal. In that forgetfulness, they impose the true idea of civilization, goodness, beauty, nobility, upon another. Rather than listening to the language or languages of a place, rather than taste and feel the distinctives of a locale, they impose the developments of goodness, beauty, nobility, and truth of their place upon the other as though their language and their places were universal. The colonizer often genuinely believed he was doing a good thing, for he was a theological agent of perfecting nature according to the logic of his place. In the process, though, the beautiful truth of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 fell away. After Jesus ascended, he sent his Spirit to fill his disciples, and the immediate manifestation was their speaking the languages of all of those present in the court around them. What the disciples learned in that instance, even if it took them 13 more chapters to sink in, was that the message of Jesus was capable of taking up the specificities of any language. Everyone present heard in his or her own tongue. Indeed, the beauty of their wondrous news was the transfiguration of all peoples and places. It was the message of the return of the possibility of Eden, where every people and place with their languages could now receive life by being encircled around the new joining of heaven and earth. Jesus, the second Adam, or a dirt person, was also the man of heaven. See 1 Corinthians 15. And in him, the heavens and earth met in intimate union again. I think it's not accidental that Paul refers to Jesus as the man of heaven, even as he calls him the second Adam in 1 Corinthians 15. And I think he gets that play on words, that he's both. But the joining did not destroy the languages of people and earth. Instead, Pentecost provided an image of the transfiguration of all the languages. That is to say, the earth in all of its complexity was capable of bearing the presence of God in Jesus the Christ. Conversely, modern colonialism destroyed places, imposing the conquering nation's languages, clothing, agricultural systems, conceptions of beauty, and systems of discipline. And they did all of this in the name of Jesus. Note, for example, the way that the world is largely divided among English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French-speaking countries, despite some contemporary parallel efforts to form the world according to Russian or Mandarin. The modern colonizers believed that their Christian civilization needed to be replicated everywhere in order to bear the infinite. This actually bears forth in primary sources if you read them. The logic of Pentecost was destroyed, and one by one, the potentially rich mosaic of languages foreshadowed in Acts 2 began to lose possibilities, with languages falling away. Equally significant was the loss of speaking the languages of the earth itself. Historian Calvin Luther Martin, which sounds like the most pious name you could come up with, he himself was not a Christian, so he defied that piety. But historian Calvin Luther Martin refers to the songs of nature. Speaking of the ancient hunter-gatherers, he notes that for them, quote, nature is above all song, power songs, songs with flattering words. They are always songs of courtesy, conveying care and respect. And directly to our point, Martin observes, quote, what is important is that man the hunter realized that animals spoke languages human persons were capable of learning, on animals' terms and in their realms. The same people, Martin argues, learn that places too have songs, which Martin finds instructive for us. Quote, by learning where one is through the song taught by the place, one discovers likewise who one is. Hence, who one is determined and transmitted by the powers of where one is. And that knowledge of where comes significantly from the music inherent in the place beings themselves. Again, we humans have the capacity and obligation. Actually, that second part's a question for him. Again, we humans have the capacity and obligation to tune our imaginations to the songs of place and so fix our bearings on where and who we are. End quote. Arguably, this precise point is the one that God is making to Job when bombarding him with the litany of questions, most of which situate Job within creation and God as the creator and caretaker of it all. One could look too to Psalm 108, which finds the shared context of creation to be the faithful place of worship and obligation all at once. Conversely, modern colonialism views the earth as commodity, raw material to be shaped. Recall that quote I gave from Dr. I've forgotten her name. Robin Wall Kimmerer. I should remember names. One could refer to this as the McDonald's effect, where the goal is rarely sensitive to the language or music of a place, but instead the imposition of a form of maturity upon a place. Wherever we go, we can be sure that McDonald's is basically the same because its ingredients are produced centrally and exported to its various locations. Recall Kimmerer's lament over the earth forced into submission to take the form of our own convenience, and, I would add, anxiety. The earth is terraformed according to the image of economic ideas, all of which arose from particular philosophical meditations in a particular part of the world, abstracted for the terraforming process of colonialism. The earth was no longer a collection of people with local languages derived from their being in the earth. It was now an idea, a quote, globe, that enraptured bodies from the earth and brought them into the imagination of those who had ceased to hear the languages of the earth itself. Local languages began to die, both the languages of cultures and the languages of intricate ecosystems. The earth became raw commodity to be conquered, developed, and sold. One crisis, the crisis of the destruction of the earth through the ignoring of her languages and music, enveloped and continues to envelop another, the crisis of drawing people into dependence upon another for the sake of solidification of the power of the other. The overlapping crisis has resulted in peoples racialized at the same time as their earth was transformed into super farms whose purpose was to export food to the rest of the world. Historian Mike Davis's award-winning history of colonization, famine, and death in India, China, and Brazil tells one such story. In his book, Late Victorian Holocausts, Davis chronicles the effects of the weather phenomenon El Niño on multiple regions of the world. Drought and famine ensued. The problem, though, was not precisely the lack of food. The problem was the inability of the earth to sustain the amount of yield that the British Empire demanded for exportation and sale at the center of their global empire. The results were the death of approximately 32 million people in India, China, and Brazil from starvation, even though adequate food was readily born of their part of the world. The Brits themselves were not starving and would not have starved, Davis argues, but were not willing to diminish their reserves or their financial bottom line. Indians were welcome to buy their own crop back, but if they could not, that was their problem. More precisely, the poor died terrifying deaths. They starved. The same things ensued again during World War II, this time at the hands of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who made it clear that he thought Indian lives less valuable. One could look, too, to the ravaging effects of American-owned banana plantations in Costa Rica, where people and land suffer from brutal farming practices that include heavy use of pesticides. Beyond food, we could look to the effects of mining in Africa, so that we have smartphones. I have a visual aid here, so you know that I'm not saying don't have one. Yes, Mary, I have one now. Too many asides, forgive me. Somewhere in here is where I was. Beyond food, we could look to the effects of mining in Africa so that we can have smartphones and the drilling for oil so that we can drive our cars, sometimes at 200 miles per hour around giant oval tracks, and enable wealthy businessmen to fulfill lifelong desires to fly outside Earth's breathable atmosphere for 4 to 8 minutes. If that sounds ridiculous, it's supposed to. Or we could look to the waste that we produce and export, leaving obscene amounts of plastic to sit in fields next to houses in Southeast Asia, where perpetual fires burn, releasing toxic fumes into the air that local people breathe. The message is relatively clear. The earth is ours to use and abuse, and some lives are more dispensable and thus worth subjecting to the effects of the abuse. Those lines are racially drawn.
Yep.
Meanwhile, we no longer hear the music of God's creation, the same music that Tolkien celebrated, and more importantly, that God reminded us groans for its restoration. The only music we hear is the electronic beats in our earbuds. I also have earbuds, so I'm not saying don't have them. Maybe we shouldn't, but then I'm a hypocrite. There is a larger tale to tell deep within the wounds. We could speak of the formation of identity. If Eden saw identity intimately binding together in life, the heavens and the earth, and humanity as creatures of the earth commissioned by the God of heaven, the expulsion from Eden necessarily signals identity formed in ways bound by death. We could speak of the dirt people's loss of ears to hear the languages of the earth and the subsequent ravaging of the earth. We could speak of the colonized pulled away from the earth, such that bodies no longer receive definition from being in from the earth, but instead from cultural markers of distance from the colonizers and their universal ideas. We could speak of racial formation amid the same colonizing and terraforming processes, as people called themselves white and named others black, and others somewhere in between, established rules for who could migrate into whiteness. All of these are significant aspects of the tale of the modern world. But before we tell these stories, we need to listen. The rocks really do cry out. In distress, in hope of renewal, and in worship. Why not the people of the dust too? Thank you. So I had plenty of examples that I thought about including that thought maybe it's overkill, but I'm happy to go into more if you're interested. But in the meantime, receiving questions is probably the best way. So I take it that's a first question.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to make sure I understand what you mean by song of like song or the sound of creation. Just to clarify what that means. Does that mean like the people group and who they are?
So when Calvin Luther Martin is arguing, he's talking specifically about those who he spent a lifetime studying, First Nations peoples, particularly of what we think of as northern Canada and Alaska today. I'm meaning to say that you actually see this theme reverberating through various peoples throughout the earth. If you look at the music of many peoples, music is most centrally seen as a listening to what's around them, right? So you have these very deeply earthly tunes. If you listen to my own native Indian as in India music, there's a very earthy quality to it. If you listen to First Nations peoples, you hear that earthy quality. Even if you listen today to Yo-Yo Ma's cello playing, the way in which he plays it has an incredible earthy quality that's distinctly Chinese, right? You can get the same with the Aboriginal peoples of Africa, Australia. So what I mean here to say is that we can think metaphorically of the music of the earth, but I want to imply that maybe there's just something more than metaphorical going on. That there is actually music to creation. There's a music that we either have the ability to hear or we've atrophied our ability to hear it. So my suggestion is, and Tolkien himself had a wonderful opening story that's his creation account where he uses that music metaphor. And I think he means something more than metaphor as well. So does that clarify?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Great.
My question is just going off of when you were talking about land and like where it gets its meaning from in terms of relation. What can that be said about African Americans and the fact that they were once viewed as land and attributed certain things and how it affects like modern day race relations as a people who are characteristically like made something in America and have stayed here and went from being land to person?
Yeah, we say viewed as land, viewed as property.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think they go hand in hand, right? So if you begin to, if you initially see people as intimately tied to their place, then you begin to see that they're shaped by them, right? They're eating what's present. Their customs work accordingly. I mean, I think there's a wonderful work of history called Shadows at Dawn that's chronicling what we have come to know as the Camp Grant massacre near modern-day Tucson, Arizona. And so the author, what he's doing is he's setting up the main characters. And two of the main sets of characters are First Nations groups. And tribes wouldn't be quite right, because as you start to realize when he's unpacking them, there's a people known as the Udam in their local tongue. But the Udam are not just the Udam. Udam means people. That's all it means. So they call themselves the people. But specifically they call themselves, and I can't remember their actual name, their terms, but we're the river people, we're the desert people, we're the coast people. And their lives were shaped accordingly. And they saw themselves as deeply tied to those. And then there was another group that is often called the Apache. Their own name for themselves are the Ni. And these Ni also meant people, and they described themselves accordingly too, right? There was the Ni of the valley, there were the Ni of the great oak. And so you figured, oh wow, there's that oak that's clearly a great one. That's where the Ni see themselves as living, right? So they were identifying themselves and their lives by where they were. Additionally, their seasons were done that accordingly. So there's a wonderful book by William Cronin, another historian, where he's doing what's called an eco-history of New England. So he's describing how the land itself changed as we move from the First Nations peoples there to the conquering Puritans. When the First Nations peoples were there, they worked on a lunar cycle, and they understood every lunar cycle intricately named according to what they did. So this was the moose hunting month. This is the harvesting month. This is the planting month. This is the berry picking month, or the nut picking month, right? Just on and on and on. And that was how their lives were shaped. the suggestion is that at some point, through the colonization effort, that way of identifying oneself was stripped away, and modalities of difference became identifying markers, right? Where there's an understandable difference, where we can say, you and I are different. The basic nature of that is that people recognize that we are not the same person, and people don't come up to me and say, hey, Alan. And I'd imagine you don't get people coming up to you and saying, hey, Varma. So that's just a natural difference, and people recognize it. There are also differences in peoples from different places, right? It's undeniable that people who are from India look very different than people who are from Africa or people from England. But when you don't have that mode of identification that's deeply tied to a life in a place, you have to have another mode of identification, so those differences become the mode of identification. Meanwhile, already in the system is a recognition by those who colonized that land is commodity. It's something that can be bought and sold. Now, one could look to the Old Testament and say, well, that's what's happening there. If someone's in debt, they can sell their land. But that's not exactly what's happening, right? The person who sells his or her land doesn't receive a cash return by which to pay a debt. That person is now tied to that land and now in servitude to that land. So it doesn't solve a debt in the sense of commodity. It signifies a debt. And it's only released at the year of Jubilee. But with commodity, it's the land that I live on can fully transfer from ownership from me to another. Now, it's a funny thing because we have quite a bit of land behind our house for strange reasons, but which I won't go into. But you see lots of animals back there, right? Anything from the everyday squirrels and rabbits and chipmunks to the other day we saw a hawk that was a little bit terrifying to see that close. Or we've seen coyotes, foxes, the undesirable skunk, right? Things like that, possums, raccoons. None of them seem to get that land has changed ownership. They just come and go. And then people build fences, and then the fences are meant to keep them out, and they find ways through them eventually. Initially it disrupts them, but eventually they come through, right? This is all to say there's something unique about the way that we're viewing land, where we can say, I can sell this. I bought it from the Palmer family, and if I want to, I can sell it to the Charles family, or something like that, right? That view of land begins to be placed upon humans as well, where humans also can be property. Now, it is an ironic turn, because it's a people who saw themselves as deeply tied to their land anyway. So not only are they being taken, their land is also being taken, and both are being commodified, but that's being done separately, right? Or the land is being torn apart for mining or farming, or to build the military posts so that you can go further into the land and conquer more to do the farming and the mining. And the people, meanwhile, are being reshaped. So the people who saw themselves as tied to a place and identified themselves in a place and knew the place and perhaps heard the song of that place and sang the song of that place, who potentially could have been people who began to direct that song to Jesus, are now pulled away from it and sold accordingly, in a way in which their own identifying markers are being forced into different modes, right? So those two people look the same. That's how they're identified. They belong together. What we know well enough from history that it didn't work that easily. There were plenty of current fights, conflicts that have broken out because of that logic, right? Whether it be in Rwanda, or it be in the Middle East, where people said, but we're not the same people. Just because we look alike doesn't mean we're the same people. Now, I'll put this again in the context of that example I was using with the udam and the knee. One of the fascinating things about it is that Carl Jacobi, who's the author, the historian, he's describing how there's misunderstandings that creep into play. So the knee now enter into a treaty with the new American group that's coming out to settle the land that they've just acquired from Mexico. Now, the very thought that they've acquired the land is itself confusing. I've described how squirrels don't get that. Well, the knee didn't get that either. It's not like their grounds for hunting was suddenly off limits. Oh, we were once hunting in Mexico, but now we're in America and we have to cross into Mexico to hunt, so we won't hunt. They didn't work that way. They're viewed as primitive for that. How do you not get this? But it's in a totally different imagination, right? Well, furthermore, they see themselves in different places. So we, the knee of the great oak, are not the same as the knee of the valley. So the knee of the oak enter into a treaty with the Americans coming. And the Americans are coming, and American was at the time a euphemism that just meant white person. So when they have a treaty here, the Americans say, okay, you've entered into a treaty, and then these knee go forth, and their lands are being divided up and destroyed through these building of fences and things like that. So they need animals. So they began to undertake the process of saying, well, there are some cows. Those are animals. We can try those out. Well, the cows, of course, were domesticated animals. So now it's viewed as stealing. They're not thinking in those terms. But they do get that these cows belong to the grounds of the American of the Valley. We have a treaty with them. We don't do that. So they go 2 miles down the road and take the cows of another group. And the Americans think, wait, what just happened? You made a treaty with us, and there you go doing this. We didn't make a treaty with them. We made a treaty with you. The Americans are thinking racially. You made a treaty with one American. American is a racial identity marker. You've made a treaty with them. Conversely, this group of knee of the oak made a treaty with them. The knee of the valley didn't. So the knee of the valley might come in and say, we take these cows because we have nothing else to take. Things have been changed. And now they say, you violated the treaty again. You weren't supposed to take from us. They said, we didn't make a treaty with you. What are you talking about? Yeah, you did. You both are, quote, Apaches. So when we made a treaty with the Apaches, we made a treaty with the Apaches. They're not thinking in those terms. They're thinking in terms of locality, right? That contrast is what's at play here, right? Where different formations of imagination, a viewing of land as something to be bought and sold, is something that then takes a turn into something where it's, well, you people are something less too. You're stupider. You don't get these dynamics, these sophisticated dynamics. And we know it further because this is an actual judicial case that said this. Several of these cases. It was, you didn't build any fences, so you don't actually own this land. Now you might think, what do fences have to do with anything? Think in terms of the price difference between selling a plot of land over here versus selling a plot of land with a building already on it. The people that are coming in to build in this area where there are buildings but they're knocking them down, they bought it for an undisclosed amount that's somewhere north of 100 million. But what we do know is that their development is over $1 billion. Same land, how is there that big change? Well, the change is that the development of the land counts as a greater value for the land. Well, that's precisely what fences are. Fences are developing the land by cordoning it off, creating a very safe and secure spot, the area where the cows can roam and eat the grass. And then we then have those cows for the purposes of meat or milk. Right? The fact that that notion was missing meant that you're uncivilized, you're unsophisticated, and even the word dumb was used. And you don't actually own the land. So it's our God-given right, those are the actual words used again, our God-given right to take it and to develop it, because that's the task of subduing the earth. Genesis 1 and 2. Right? What I've argued is that's not the task of subduing the earth. The task is one of a gardener and a zoologist. And I would recommend Richard, well, you'll read it for Theo, the Richard Bauckham essay that you'll have to read. He's making that case as well. Does that help with your question? Great. Yeah, I see another hand there.
I heard you talking about, a little bit mentioning the way that a lot of languages are dying out as especially English takes over and people are demanded to know the universal languages that other people know. And I've heard about that in the context of Bible translation and the speed, the desperation to finish or at least start Bible translations in new languages before they get wiped out. So could you talk a little bit about that maybe?
Yeah, I would be lying if I said I know the depths of what precisely the conversations are you're talking about. But do you want me to talk about why I would think it's important to do that work
Sure.
before they die out?
And maybe like
Sure. For one, I'd have to say there's something to beware of. And that's the way that translations have often served to function in ways in which particular ways of viewing the world are what are being translated, right? And not to rag on any one translation, but if you read, for instance, the ESV, there's an undeniable Baptist leaning in it that's maybe not quite as obvious apart from the translation, right? If you're reading it in Hebrew and Greek. This is not to rag on Baptists, but it's to say a translation is more than just a neutral act. And so there's increasingly work being done to say translations have been used precisely to form people in particular theologies as an act that was tied to the colonization process. And that's something I think translators themselves are increasingly aware of and don't want to do. On the positive side of the act of translating, I think that's one of the beautiful things about the story of Jesus, that it's not limited to Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek. I know we sometimes talk that way, like you better learn your Hebrew or Aramaic and Greek, because if you read it in English, it's like reading it in black and white, but if you read it in those languages, it's in color. I'm not sure that that's true, even by the testimony of the text itself. Right? It doesn't seem like what's being done in the book of Acts, for instance, is that God's saying, you got it and that's enough, it's sufficient, but it's not the best. So this is in the meantime what you do before you learn Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek. In fact, Acts goes out of its way to make sure you know that the symbol of the Holy Spirit coming and transforming and giving a great sign of transformation is apparent in each location where the message of Jesus enters in for the first time. Whether that be among the Jews in their many languages in chapter 2, or the entering into Cornelius, or the entering in with Samaritans, or the entering in terms of what Paul experiences on the broader level, right? It's the same experience, meaning to say, as Peter says in chapter 15, the same Spirit is at work. That seems to be a deliberate point of Acts. So if I can say that learning Hebrew and Greek can be valuable, but they're not the same as saying you understand it better, what I can say in reverse is that it seems to be that the Bible is going out of its way, whether it be in the book of Acts, or it be in many of the passages like in Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel, where it's foreshadowing the state of Revelation, or the book of Revelation itself, where you see the image of people from many tribes and tongues together worshiping God. That the act of translation is a participation in that, not a bringing about of it in the sense that we're inaugurating the end, but in the sense that we can do a valuable work of saying we value this because this actually enhances the beauty of what we're trying to say concerning Jesus. That Jesus, yes, he fulfills the promise to Abraham of having that seed who would be the true Israel embodied within him. But he also fulfills that promise to Abraham that says all the nations will be blessed in your seed, right? And all the nations means not make the nations into Israel. In fact, that's probably the most repeated question in the New Testament in one way, shape, or form. Do Gentiles have to become Jews? And the answer is overwhelmingly no. So it's a funny thing when we try to act like Gentiles have to become another kind of Gentile. In contrast, the beauty of translation is that we don't have to do that. We can celebrate that there's an angle of entry that's being proclaimed by hearing Jesus in another language. That's the same Jesus and the same message, but it's performed in a new place with its ways of thinking of Apple, so to speak. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Matt, you get to see him.
Okay, so I hope I word this correctly the best I can. But, so when we started talking about six-day creation, my ears automatically perked up. My hot take for the day is that I do not believe in six-day creation. But my question is, when we look at the story of creation from a spatial view instead of a chronological view, it very much makes sense what you're saying in the light of science of how you can't have one thing without the other. You can't have animals without the land. And even just going back to like the Big Bang Theory and all that, how can would that be, looking at it from a parallel point of view, would that be an argument for theistic evolution?
I don't know. I'm intrigued by the question. I'm sympathetic to the interest. I take a generally agnostic view of I'm intrigued but don't really care. What I will say is, and relating it to what I'm saying here, I think it signifies another language. So it becomes a mechanism by which we can speak the wonders of Jesus all over again from another angle. So I don't see the science as, we talked about this earlier actually, right? I don't see the sciences as something to be feared. Like any language, it's a language that can be baptized by the presence of Jesus. And that means you can say some pretty cool things. So the book I was quoting, Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braided Sweetgrass, she's a botanist who's also a First Nations woman. And the book is fascinating because she's bringing both of those things together. She's bringing ancient First Nations wisdom that she's grown up with, that's been passed along from generation to generation. She's bringing her learnings. Being that you have days that if they are 24-hour days as we know them, and we've measured 24-hour days as the rotation of the Earth on its axis relative to the sun, and that sun's not there until day 4, what in the world are days on days 1 to 3? Another one being plants come on day 3 as a signifier of the dry land, and the dry land having life. And people and animals come on day 6, and then you get to Genesis 2, and there are no plants because there are no people to work the garden, or work the earth in the garden. Just a couple of things that are rather odd if what we're trying to do there is be overly literalistic. What is going on? Well, that's the point in which I say there are creative possibilities, and I love listening to them. There's more, right? You can think beyond that in terms of the fall happens, and the fall, if we read it at face value as it's saying this is all there is, then there's just 2 people. And then a chapter later, there are 4 people. And Cain does something awful and spills the blood of Abel, and he's cursed for it. And then one of his curses is to go wander the earth where he encounters cities. Who made these cities and who's populating these cities? Were Adam and Eve really active and we just didn't get an account of it? I mean, there are a lot of ways you can parse that, but it doesn't say, and I don't think it cares to say. Right? In fact, we move really quickly from in the beginning to, and now there's Abraham. 12 chapters. The 12th chapter is Abraham, right? I don't think the point is to give us those sorts of things. So I think science can give you another language that says, I'm asking this question, and I think you see beautiful things in it that, at least to me, they make me marvel and wonder at, wow, God did that.
There's God of order.
The God of order. The God who is not just the God of order, though. The God who is the God of seemingly the unnecessary. You know, there's no scientific reason that leaves have to change in the fall between green and crumbling brown. Red and orange and yellow are biologically unnecessary, but they're pretty cool and beautiful. And I think that matters, right? I think the brown and crumbly are really beautiful too, and I love crunching the leaves. I'm a little kid in that sense. And there's huge scientific rationale for that, right? They decompose, and that releases nutrients back into the soil and prepares the soil then for the spring for things to grow. A lot of important things happen there. But that in-between stage just simply is beautiful, and I think we can say, wow, God does that too. It's not just functional.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I'll work back around.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out how to formulate this question, but it's in regard to the connection possibly to kind of what you're talking about with environmental theology and race in terms of like much of this demographic within America that is hesitant to affirm the validity of like climate change happening within this day and age. Obviously, I'm working from the presupposition that I think it's real and it's happening, but do you think there's some sort of connection that between some of this theology of land and then also a certain demographic kind of denying some of the science of climate change today? Is there some sort of connection? I don't know. I just can't figure out the words, but if there's something you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think there's a connection. How much to say? One of the connections, I think, is that there's a loss of imagination of how the earth matters for our very selves, so that even if we know the supermarket doesn't grow our food, we do functionally live as if that's where the food comes from, right? I asked my kids, they're 2, 4, 5, and 7, so you can excuse their ignorance, but I asked them this like a year ago. I said, or maybe 2 years ago, where does the food come from? And they all said, the fridge. I said, okay, where does the fridge get it from? The grocery store. And that's laughable, but at the same time, I think we operate that kind of way, right? Now my kids are sufficiently brainwashed to know that that's not really what I'm asking. And they'll say, from the earth. So that's right. But if you're not conditioned in a way in which you think of how you belong, I think Richard Bauckham does a good job of this, the biblical scholar, of pointing out even our language of stewardship seems to indicate that we're not part of it. We're on the outside taking care of it, right? The thing we're taking care of is in a greenhouse right here, and we occasionally pop in and do what we need to and then close the door. And that's just not the image you get in Scripture, to the point where we miss certain things because we're not accustomed to seeing them. Well, if you're already accustomed in that way, and then you throw on top of that a sense of land is something to be bought and sold and developed and made better, you're not going to be very happy to hear that that very act of doing that is hurting the earth. Now, I will say, and I thought about including this, but I may as well include it now, because this is a good time. There is a certain irony that I find. Have you heard of the anthropic principle? So the anthropic principle, for those who don't, is basically that there's a fine-tuning of a bunch of things all together at once that makes it possible for the earth to sustain life, right? You look out in the rest of the solar system, and there's even scientists who have no interest in Christian questions who've been asked, and they say, we believe there's life out there, but we have no reason to actually believe it. And what they mean by that is that as they look out there, there's no indicators of the sorts of distinctiveness that the earth has to sustain an atmosphere where there could even be life as we know it. But, they point out, there are billions of stars with solar systems and billions of galaxies with their own stars and solar systems, that it would be naive if we said there couldn't possibly be anything. So that's what they're playing, and I say, yeah, sure, fine. But I think that's intriguing, because what's being said there implicitly is there's a very fine-tuning of things, and Christians love to grab a hold of the anthropic principle. They'll point out things like, we'll point out things, not to mean I'm not one of the Christians, that there's a rotation of the earth on its axis. And that rotation on its axis is at just the right angle so as to allow the heat distribution through the atmospheric changes and pressures and movements of the earth, so that it doesn't get too hot, even when we think it's too hot, that it can't sustain life. Or it won't stay too hot for so long that it can't sustain life. Right? And that's joined with the precise speed of the Earth's rotation, with the speed of the Earth's revolution around the sun, so that all these are fine-tuned in such a way that we don't suddenly spin off into space or make a dive into the sun, both of which would be bad. Right? Now, that anthropic principle has a note within it, again, of the Earth's axis being precise. Now, this is observable stuff that over the last few years, the Earth's axis has shifted. And I don't know exactly which way, but maybe from this, to a noticeable degree. And the reason is fairly obvious. There's a redistribution of weight on the Earth, because the polar ice caps are not as big and therefore as heavy. And as we know, water's not going to just stay there, it's going to redistribute. which may make one wonder, why is it that we're having so many wildfires and extreme heat on one hand, terrible hurricanes and earthquakes on the other hand, flooding in other places, mudslides in others? It could be coincidence, it's probably not. But the irony to me is that on the one side, the anthropic principle is supported as an apologetic argument for theism. But it's completely ignored then when we talk about, well, maybe this is really bad then, that the Earth's axis has shifted. And it's shifted very clearly because ice has melted. I think there's a connection. I'd be lying if I said I could work out for you internally why those connections aren't being made. I admit that I didn't grow up in the church. I didn't grow up with the hostility towards science that I know many have. And so I'm playing a little bit of catch up on that. Everyone in my family is in the world of science. My sister's a physician, my father's a physician, my mother's an occupational therapist. I have conservatively 10 uncles and aunts who are doctors. I have several cousins who are doctors. I have a cousin who's an engineer. It kind of, science is just taken for granted. I'm the weird one who said, I was pre-med by the way, so I'm further weird because I let that go and I went to theology. And you go to Indian functions and there's always this, theology, that's interesting. You know that interesting means something different than it might mean here, you know? So I'm playing catch up there, but there's definitely a connection. I don't really quite get the internal rationale as to why it's okay to speak of, for instance, the anthropic principle for apologetics, but then to say, well, that's just secular science, when there's the comment of polar ice caps actually are melting. So I don't know if that helps, but it's a start maybe. I don't know which one of you is first. Do you care? You're behind, so did you see if you were first? Okay, well then we'll go with you.
I also have some.
Perfect.
So, sort of like a follow-up question from a different perspective is that we see like a lot of Western Christian circles tie ourselves to the space of heaven as believers rather than to physical places, and therefore we overlook, like for instance, I have family members who would say, like, yes, sure, genocide in America happened, that was a thing, but it brought the space of heaven to America. Like, now we are a Christian country, and ultimately, like, since that is our main concern as believers, like, we shouldn't be as worried about, like, say, the connection between First Nations people and land, or between Black people torn from their land and, like, replanted here. How would you answer that? How would you like explain or define that connection in a way that makes sense?
At the risk of sounding dismissive, I would start with simple things like the Bible doesn't seem to share that view, right? The Bible has a very earthy understanding, whether it be these Psalms like Psalm 108 or Psalm 19 that are deeply tying themselves to a beautiful recognition of the earth. Or it be passages that we haven't noticed, like in Deuteronomy chapter 20. We definitely notice Deuteronomy 20 when it comes to questions of, the difficult questions of God commanding Israel to go in and how they're to deal with people along the way and in the land. Which itself is interesting, right? There's the language of those who are far versus those who are near, which is worth exploring. What we don't notice is the last 3 verses of Deuteronomy 20, which is where God says, don't cut down the trees. And I'll admit that I read that. I had to have read it several times because I know that I read the Bible and I know that I'd read all of Deuteronomy a few times. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I read that and I said, well, that's strange. And I wasn't even reading it for that. I was reading it for the tough question of, is God commanding genocide of the Canaanites? But it's not out of nowhere, right? If you begin to read the internal logic of the narrative, it actually makes a lot of sense. But why do we miss it is the question here. And the reason we miss it, I think, is because we're not accustomed to see that as significant, so we quickly breeze by it, like the way that we do many passages that we say, well, that happened, right? Or like the Levites, the Levitical traditions. Okay, that's kind of boring. I read it, but I wasn't paying attention, and we moved on. Well, there's actually some interesting nuggets in the middle of all those Levitical things, right? Well, what does God say in Deuteronomy 20? He says, don't cut down the trees. And then he says, well, okay, you can cut down some of them for siege weapons, but not the ones that bear fruit, because they give you food. And it's good food, and you eat that food, and you need that food. It's the local food. And then when the siege is done, stop cutting down trees. All within those 3 verses. I would point as well to how frequent the metaphors and signs that Jesus uses are very earthy. Whether it be the mustard seed, whether it be talking about a camel and how a camel can't fit through the eye of a needle, whether it be cursing a tree. What's that? The field and the sowers. Yeah. Right. Or the ladies who showed up with olive oil for their lamps and those who didn't. Olive oil. This isn't go down to the store and buy the container of oil. This isn't go to the Shell station and fill a bucket for your lawnmower. This is pressed olives. Right? And that's just a start. And I would point to the fact that the very end of the book of Revelation has a new tree. And that tree is giving food to the birds and to all the other creatures. And that tree, by the way, is present in the Proverbs, in Psalms, and Ezekiel, just among a few places. So I'd point to those sorts of things and say, why is it that we've missed those sorts of things? Maybe that says more about us. What is some of the things it says about it? One, I think it says is that for all the fighting the early church did against Gnosticism, they were also deeply formed by the same threads, right? They may not have fallen into Gnosticism, but they were formed by threads that were deeply Greek philosophical, where the real is still something ideal. Well, idealism hasn't gone away, as I tried to say earlier. And one could speak as well about the impetus for power, right? When Constantine takes over, how does that happen? How does Constantine successfully conquer in the sign of the cross? How is it that the church says, this is a good idea? Now keep in mind, this is the same church that held sacred, and still holds sacred, passages such as the book of Luke, where Jesus says to his disciples, we're going, take your swords. And they naturally, as we would probably think, they're thinking, oh good, we're going to fight. We're not going down without a fight. And so Peter, understandably, pulls out that sword and chops off the ear. And Jesus says, put that away. And he takes the ear and glues it back on the head. Divine glue, right? And you can imagine being Peter. You told me to bring this sword. And you can also imagine Jesus saying, you still don't get it. I told you to bring the sword so that you wouldn't use it, right? It's the symbol of power, I'm not using it. Well, that same sword proceeds from the mouth of the Lamb who was slain in Revelation. Now, some would read that as, he was once slain, and next he'll come and he'll use the sword. I don't think that's what it's saying. I think that sword is deeply an image of the word coming from the mouth. So it's the mouth of the one who was slain will bear forth that true conquering reality, the words that will save, right? Or you could point to the fact that Jesus, throughout Mark, tells people, oh, okay, you get that I'm the Messiah, don't tell anybody that. Well, the implication seems to be clear that because they think Messiah means go conquer and be in control. How is it that the church that held on to that, when Constantine came, could so easily say, this is good? I think it's been a long time that at least certain branches of the church have given into the impulse of the normative understanding. Not this is the good, right? Not the good news that the gospel could also take the form of the Greek philosophers, but rather this is the form. There's that sort of pseudo-Gnostic impulse, but then also that to be in control. You put those together, you've moved away from creation, and you begin to see the dominion claim as control. And I think the rest sort of follows relatively naturally. Anna, sorry, you were trying to say.
I was going to talk how, like, Adam and Eve have to leave the garden because they can't eat of the tree of life anymore because it produces eternal life. That's the tree that you're talking about.
That's the one I'm talking about, right? That's significant, that you're not allowed to eat of this tree anymore. Something has to happen first. But the tree's coming back, and John in his own gospel spells out imagery for us, right? For me, the dense one, to be able to say, oh, so that image that you give us again at the end of Revelation of the river nourishing that tree from which all creatures are nourished, that river is the Holy Spirit, John says, and it's flowing from the throne of Christ. Oh, okay, I get it. So he gives us a cheat, like the what is it called? The Cliff Notes version, which is nice. I would throw into this as well, by the way, that simultaneous with these moves of forgetting that they were reading in a particular tongue and beginning to universalize the gospel in a Greek philosophical world, and simultaneous with the entrance into a conquering mode, is a forgetfulness too that they'd reversed the New Testament narrative, right? Where again, maybe the most frequent question in the New Testament is, do Gentiles have to become Jews? If you read early church documents from the 2nd century forward, increasingly you get people saying, you can't be a Jew and be a Christian. Now that's a strange radical turnaround. We went from the presumption by some that you had to become a Jew to follow Jesus to you couldn't possibly follow Jesus if you're a Jew. So you have people who are Jewish who convert to Christianity, who've been successfully infiltrated here, who say, I'm denouncing my Jewishness. And you have others talking now increasingly about the Jews being the worst. Even Augustine by the end of the 300s and early 400s says, and look, a lot of these people say a lot of wonderful things, so don't hear me saying just trashing them. But what Augustine says is God keeps the Jews around to show you what he does to those who reject him. He says that in the City of God. So we also shouldn't be surprised that all those things happen simultaneously, right? So another piece of this that I didn't bring in is the very deeply theological impulse of manifest destiny. So if you read the Puritans, the Mayflower Compact is a covenant with them and God in which they describe themselves as the people of God entering into the new Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey. And by implication, therefore, the people who are there are the Canaanites who must be converted or destroyed. This was a theological event. You put all those things together, the belief about the land, the belief about conquest, and the belief about being Israel who's supposed to conquest, which even Israel was supposed to do that. We can begin to understand how, in a certain sense, the land becomes eclipsed, and they're not seeing the significance how they themselves are born of the earth. And undoubtedly, 200 years from now, people will point out the things that we've missed. So I don't want to miss that reality, but these are serious things that lead to other sorts of things, like an over-evaluation of what the Bible must mean. And I've heard someone say this, Professor Steffi, you've at least heard a rumor of this one, where I actually heard this person say it, who doesn't teach here anymore. I don't care if there's a moose between me and that oil, we'll shove that pipeline through its head to drill that hole to get to it. And the guy thought it was simultaneously funny and he was serious. Well, you can kind of get where that comes from, right? There's extreme versions of it. Most people wouldn't be willing to say that, but there's lesser versions of it too.
All right, so I wrote this question out, passed it down to people, and then rewrote this question to make sure it made sense. But I'm still not sure if it makes sense. I'm not sure if it makes sense. I can't even speak English anyway. So thinking back to where you were speaking about the impact, like the impact of what we've done to the land negatively and how we've seen those effects drawn racially, I was wondering if, I'll just read what I said. I have seen and read that there are and have been lines drawn in the same sense around economic ideology and worldview groups. Are these lines tied to racial groups throughout history, or does it shift as the way in which we identify people in group terms shifts?
Could you clarify, are there specific ideologies that you're thinking of?
Well, I'm thinking I'm thinking religious and like religious, political, and philosophical ideologies. I know all those things tend to be tied to one another.
Capitalism versus communism, sorts of things?
Somewhat. I go maybe a little further and maybe go Marxism versus capitalism, just in the sense that I feel like that was more of a complete worldview.
Sure. So Marx himself was German, and he belongs to the same people group that give you other ideologies. What I think is significant is that the embracing of Marxism in the biggest form was first the Russians. You should talk to Professor Papendorf about this. He's read some on the Russians, and he's shared some of this with me that is really fascinating, where the short answer is to say, yes, there's definitely racial things going on. The idea of being white was not quite what the idea of being white is today. Today it's a generic term, so everyone with a certain kind of skin tone, roughly, is considered white. That's not the genesis of it. So the English, for instance, would refer, I'm not condoning this, but their language was those swarthy French. And what they meant by that was that their skin is dirty. Or those greasy Italians, meaning that their hair is dirty. And they saw these as biological terms and they called them racial. Or the Irish. You can't get much more similar without being English than the Irish. They were racially other. In fact, they would compare the Irish to Africans, people of African descent. And that was universally by everyone seen as dirty and backwards. The language was often those burnt people. Meanwhile, the French would do the same thing. The Spanish would do the same thing. And for all of them, the Russians were racially other. Even today, if you look at the ways in which the lines are drawn, they're technically racially other in terms of the categories. Now, it's a funny thing because race today in terms of whiteness is a fairly generic term that encompasses a lot of people that didn't used to be considered white. So there's a performance of living into it. Why haven't the Russians been into this? Well, on the Russian side, they for a long time wanted to be included. You can sort of get the sense of, in fact, at least from the stuff that Papendorf has told me, so I defer a bit to him, but he's told me from his research that there's a sense that the Russians were trying really hard to say, no, us too, and so they're trying to create a project that's very similar to say, we're also part of this in-group, we're not part of the out-group, we're not like them. I don't think it's surprising then that they pick up one of these Germanic philosophical things and they take a hold of it. Right, and they form their own counter community, their community that becomes the real big rival to most Western nations. And I don't think it's surprising that what are really rivaling philosophical theories within the same larger modern landscape become so opposed to each other that you can basically hear someone say you're a Marxist or you're a communist and know that they aren't trying to talk, they're using an ideological four-letter word, right? Yeah. You're dirty, you're one of those people. I know this because I've heard it said a lot, around here at Moody even, that's just Marxist. And no argument is made to say, first of all, how it's Marxist. I've heard, there's a theologian, Willie Jennings. I think it's funny, he's been called Marxist by people who haven't read him. And I know they haven't read him because in the very first chapter of his big book, The Christian Imagination, he explains how Marxism also creates a similar problem. You know, if you just read the first chapter, you'd hopefully have the nuance to say it's not the same. But that's not the point. The point is to say he doesn't think he's Marxist, but he's Marxist, which is really just a way of saying he doesn't belong. He's something else. Now, I'm not here trying to defend Marxism. I'm just saying that it's caught within the same program. So that there's a book called The Legacy of Ashes, really fascinating. It's based upon 50,000 declassified CIA documents around 2008 during the early Obama administration. And it's written by Pulitzer Prize winning author, I can't remember his name, but he was a big time New York Times author. And his thesis of the book is basically this: from the beginning of the CIA, which which you could say is during World War II as kind of proto-CIA, and then the CIA proper that comes after World War II, to the present. Every director of the CIA has inherited a CIA that's in a worse position than what he got it. And now for the first time we can say that she got it, with our first female CIA director. One of the things he tries to show, though, is that what made the CIA so dysfunctional, at least based upon these massive amount of declassified documents, is that on one side, they were encumbered by Senate oversight. So they weren't allowed to be as secretive as they needed to be to do their work. On the other side, they didn't really get how spy work worked. Frankly, most other spy agencies, whether it be the Russians, the Brits, the Israelis, they seem to get it better. And that chief problem that the CIA had was their solution was just throw money at it. If we give people money, then they'll flip to us. And it didn't occur to them that you can give people money and they'll say they flip to you, but they're not flipping, they're just taking your money. Right? Well, what were they throwing money at? And consistently, this is the case. They're throwing money to create a culture globally that's rejecting of communism. At the exact same time locally, there's intentional efforts through television, movies, media, books to refer to communism as that evil other alternative, right? To give a moral claim within it. Well, at the heart of this is a war against an ideology of Marxism, right? To the point where you've probably heard some things like this, right? People can criticize communism and Marxism by giving the worst version of it and compare it to the ideal version of capitalism, which, again, I'm not trying to defend one or the other, but it's just funny, right? One should have their ears perk up and say, that's not a good argument, right? That's a totally weighted argument. When you put those things together, this program of trying to make communism and Marxism into the evil, both abroad and here, with this long-standing distinctions between who gets to count as white despite how they look, right? Which, frankly, I'd say no one is really white anyway, if you want to go by color. I mean, I look at the shirt you're wearing. That's not anybody's skin color. I mean, you're wearing a white shirt too. What's your name? Sorry. Maggie. You would be considered white by many, right? Your skin is vastly different from that shirt. The fact that anyone thinks they're white says more ideologically than it does about pigment. And that's important. But the fact that that project can happen so that people say, I want to be white, because there's a definite benefit to it. And there's tons of really important works of history that have been written on this that I could recommend. And the Russians are among them, and the Russians are always the ones. They never make it in. They're always on the outside. In fact, most of Russia is in Asia. Most people in Russia are Asian. It's a very small portion of Russia that's in technically Europe, and a very small portion of Russians who look like general Europeans. But they're the ones who are put front and center. And that's on purpose. It's a racial project, and communism, Marxism, ends up being embroiled within that. Well, you can take that a step further and say, who's the big bad boogeyman of Marxism now? It's China. And you can probably trace the conversations had by left and right. They're basically the same, right? They're different versions of the exact same thing of China's the big bad evil. Now, they may in fact be evil, I don't know, but I don't know that the US looks any better. But they're not evil because they have a particular political ideology that's different from ours. That's a game that's been long played out in terms of an intentional combining of categories. That's probably as far as I can go into that, but if you're interested, you should go to Papendorf and ask him about it, because he's done deliberate reading. He actually lent me a book to read, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it was one that he was sharing things out of, and it basically furthered this kind of thinking that this was a deliberate Russian desire to say, us too, which isn't actually unique, right? I mean, in some ways, you can say that if the West is really the center of a global empire, which I think it is, a lot of cultures are saying, we can do that too. My own people in India, you can very clearly see that there's a desire to say, anything you can do it better. Right? You make a smartphone, keep your smartphone out, we'll make another smartphone that's even better, that's purely Indian made by Indian hands. But the imagination is the same. It's a global thing, right? Yeah. I don't know who's next. Okay. Ladies first. I'm running out of voice steam.
Yeah, so my question, I'm trying to figure out like how to word it, but basically like talking about like the earth and creation, animals, you talked about like First Nations, and then also just like different religions, like Hinduism, for example, like they have like a sacredness, like a sanctity of like the earth and the animals, like to a point where like I grew up not supposed to be eating meat, but like vegetarian. And so is that just like, I don't know, I feel like Christianity, like specifically modern, like Western Christianity, I've heard different like forms of like apologetics, like arguments against like religions like Hinduism, where it's like, oh, well, you guys care so much about, like, you're so wrapped up in like the material, and like their perception of like an afterlife just looks different in the theology of that. And it speaks to like kind of what Savannah was saying of like our place is in heaven, our home is in heaven, our citizenship is in heaven. So I guess like I see like a disconnect between like what Genesis 1 and like the original intent of like human beings only ate plants, like we were vegetarian for a time being, and then Paul says like you can eat meat or you don't have to eat meat, and like it kind of opens up like more of a like personal conviction. And so yeah, I guess my question is like how are we supposed to live in that now? Because in one sense I feel like we ostracize and kind of create this like dichotomy of like other religions that practice a more like even biblical sense of like the sacredness of the earth. How can we as Christians like kind of contextualize that but not like maybe take that too far, and still like with the permission that Paul gave us, like live in the freedom of Christ? So
a nice small question. Yeah, I don't know where to start on that. First, I'd say the simplest answer is just to say, stop doing that. You know, in the sense of stop immediately demonizing. I think that there are good reasons. I mean, Calvin Luther Martin, who I was quoting, his name screams piety, as I said. His parents were missionaries. He grew up in the faith, and he talks about in one of his books how he just had enough and he left. And he criticizes Christianity as a religion that only wants to domineer and has no interest in understanding the beauty that are in his case, First Nations peoples, who he has built a life living amongst and studying. And I read them and it makes me sad, because I want to say there's a really compelling way to read God's word that doesn't do any of that. But he's not wrong to say that there's been that, right? So the sadness is not so much that he's describing something untrue as much as he's describing something and doesn't have the imagination to say the things that you love are actually deeply affirmed in some key ways. I think it would be nice if we collectively, gently, tried to recapture those things. And it can just start with reading fresh, reading anew, right? Where we're not just reading something for the sake of creating apologetic arguments. We're reading the Bible so that we can say we're doing theology again here. And it's not an independent act. We can draw upon deep resources, but it also means that we can be free to criticize the past. Not because we're trying to attack it and destroy it, but because we realize there's no It's not final, right? So if we can start there, I would hope that we could begin to look at people and say, wow, there are deep impulses that you have that are really good. And those deep impulses, I think, I fought this one for a long time. I come from a similar background to you, as you know. And it's hard to do that. It's hard to affirm something when you're told that you need to run as far away from it as you can. So I fought it, which created a lot of tension, right? It created tension within my very soul, and realizing one day what I was doing to myself, that I was living into something that was utterly particular and yet was not being acknowledged as that. I was alienating my family instead of seeing that there were deep impulses, right? So I was doing apologetics in what I think is the worst sense, rather than being deeply, meaningfully, lovingly theological. There's a movie, Lagan. Have you seen that one? Okay, you should watch it. It's on some streaming service, I'm sure. But the premise of the movie, it's an Indian movie. The premise of the movie is actually set in that same time period I was talking about, where there's great famine and people are dying because the Brits keep raising taxes and taking more and more that they don't actually need. It has a bit of an ahistorical move within it, right? This becomes the idealistic conquering of that reality rather than what actually happened historically, which is that in India alone, 20 million people died, in addition to the 12 million people in China and Brazil. But there's a moment before the big climax, and I won't spoil what the climax is, but that moment is they go to their temple and they're praying. And their praying includes the fullness of their very souls and lives and bodies, so that they're dancing in their prayers and they're singing in their prayers. And you look at that and you think, there's something deeply right about that. That's exactly where they should go, to prayer. This is something beyond them, they can't do it. What if, just what if we could say in the middle of that, Jesus? Instead of saying, oh, you pagan fools. Right? The moment you say you pagan fools, you've dismissed, rather than seeing within that an impulse that's right. We just want to tell you about Jesus. Right? That's exactly, you should be turning to Jesus, and you should be turning to God, and we want to tell you about Jesus, who is that God who's here to reconcile. I think of one of my cousins who I love dearly. She lives in Germany. She was born and raised and grew up in India, then lived in Singapore, is married now, lives in Germany, and we were talking, and she's trying to understand me as a Christian. It's because she's one of the two cousins that I'm closest to. And so she loves me, she even likes me, but she doesn't get the Christian part. And what I'm trying to tell her is something that she keeps saying, yeah, I like that. But she wants to know, so what does that mean for the religion and the faith I grew up with? I want to say, there's a lot of beautiful things in there. They shouldn't be thrown away. But what I want to say is that there's a fundamental quality to Indian faith, and that Indian faith means that you must fundamentally be Indian in order to practice it. And if you don't practice it, you fundamentally cease to be Indian. And what I'm saying is that there's this Jesus who says you don't fundamentally have to be anybody. You get to be who you are, and that can be transformed. You can continue to be Indian, and your impulses there are redirected and transformed and even transfigured. To me, that's the beauty of what we could be saying. And it doesn't mean everyone's going to buy it, but I don't think we do it because someone will buy it. We do it because we want to testify to God's love and beauty. And as I've said over and over, I think there's no more central description of God in Scripture than the repeated refrain that He is love. Well, love is an over-accepting. It's an entering into a situation. It's receiving what's been given and saying, I can work with that. And I think that kind of posture is the beginning of being able to say, I may not worship Krishna or Ram, but I can get why you do. And I can say Jesus. And I may not believe that the way forward is to celebrate Ram's rescuing of Sita from Ravan, the devil, and bringing him home. But I can get that, yeah, there is an actual rescuing by God of the bride from the conquering powers of subversion, right, of oppression, and that we can really call that with Diwali a great festival of light. You know, to me that's a more beautiful way that some might call syncretistic, but I say, is that not syncretism that we celebrate Christmas on December 25th with the giving of gifts? That was taken directly from this festival of Saturnalia. I don't think that was syncretism. I think that was a beautiful display of what could be done in the Latin world. Why can't we still do that? Does that help? Or was there more that I'm missing? It was a big question, so there's probably more.
My question's like a little bit like, should we be vegetarian?
I definitely didn't get that from the question.
But I like your answer.
Cool. Well, I can say that one more quickly. Richard Bauckham believes that pre-flood was a vegetarian society because there's no mention of anything other than eating plants, and the first shedding of animal blood is in the form of sacrifice by God himself. I look at it and say, yeah, maybe. I think you might be reading too much into it. I have a hard time believing that, for instance, lions suddenly grew sharp carnivorous teeth after the fall, right? And if that were the case, why didn't we also? But we still have these teeth that are actually vegetarian teeth. But what I will grant in that is to say that I think, apart from saying that it's religiously required to be a vegetarian, I think we are actually biologically made to be vegetarian. Our bodies, I know, do have a harder time breaking down meat. And our teeth are themselves, all the animals that have teeth like us don't eat meat. That's all I'm saying. So, is it a moral requirement? By no means. I think Bauckham even rightly says that clearly the Bible makes room to eat meat. But making room to do it doesn't mean that that was necessarily how we were designed. And I think there's something right about that, at least with humans. But I'm not going to die on that hill.
Yeah, I guess
Felix.
quickly.
Yeah, very quickly.
Really quickly, what role do you think that, just given the historical injustices you talked about against races and people groups, and even today throughout the world, and I'm really not trying to be inflammatory, but what role do you think an Augustinian and Calvinistic theology that says there is us who are chosen and there are those who are not, and there's variations in degrees of, people will say, God hates those who are not and loves those who are. How do you think that theology plays out or lends itself to these kinds of injustices against other people?
I think it's directly related. What role might it have moving forward? I think we can acknowledge that that's the cause. I'm not so convinced that. So the reading, and I always forget which minor prophet it was, but the quoting there is from the minor prophet Esau I have hated and Jacob I have loved. And it's extended. I'm not so sure that what's going on there is what we understand hatred to be. I don't know if I should say this out loud, especially with another professor here, but I'm not very convinced by Calvinistic sort of election narratives. Sorry.
But for people that do hold that.
But for people who do hold that, can we at least acknowledge we don't know what that universe entails? You don't know who is and isn't elect. We have to acknowledge at the very least that there's a sense of personal responsibility that's involved in both ministering and in receiving. So can we at least operate as if we don't know, we don't have it all right, and that we can learn something from others in the same sort of way that Paul seemed to get that he could go to the Greeks and be a Greek person, and that was okay. And he could go back to the Jews and be a Pharisee, and that was okay. I don't hear him saying, when he says there's no Jew and Greek, there's no male and female, I don't hear him saying those differences are abolished, right? That seems to go against, for the first one, Acts 15. For the second one, it seems to go against all of his seemingly very gendered distinctions between men and women. Whatever we make of those, and I'm not meaning to tip a hand right there, but Instead, what I hear him saying is that there's no status inherently built into those things. And I would want to say, by extension, the same sorts of things are true in terms of there's not a status in you that makes you better or smarter because you said yes to Jesus. So if anything, a resource that could come from Calvin or Augustine that's really helpful is you didn't even say yes because of something in you. You said yes because the Spirit regenerated you. So let's take that humility forward and say, you don't know who's going to say yes out there. So let's put our best foot forward and take a posture of humility and be servants, which is what Paul says in Philippians 2, right? Be like that. Be like the way Jesus was. Rather than take that magisterial impulse of, we've got to conquer you. We've got to prove that we're epistemologically on higher ground. I kind of say abandon the epistemology conversation. You know, we don't have that conversation we get on airplanes. We're totally cool with not asking whether a Christian designed it. Why do we have to act epistemologically superior on everything else? Can we just say, by grace, we have something to offer because we're pointing to it, not because it's something in us? Here I stand, or here I said I can do no other. Yeah. And I think one last one. There was someone over here.
Yeah, I hope this isn't heading into a different trajectory entirely, but it's really connected, and like Roth, I've written it down because I have a short-term memory loss. But I love what you said to Alan's question, that the nations are not to be like the Jews, and then that led to Anna's question, and you answering the story of Jesus is not only known to the Hebrew or in the Hebrew, and this is Pentecost, that we have all these different languages that the story of Jesus is known in. And we know that all tribes and tongues will profess that Jesus is Lord. And so ontologically and pragmatically, how does that look as the universal church? Clearly that's not uniformity, but it's unity. And then what is the correlation of the Trinity in this as well?
That's great. I think the Trinity is what we have to look at. And I would say that there are many who might say that unity precedes diversity. And I look at the Trinity and I say, I don't think we can say unity precedes diversity or diversity precedes unity. They just are together. I think that what that teaches us is a Trinitarian imagination, as I call it in class, is that you don't have unity if it's uniformity. That's not unity in a Trinitarian imagination. Unity is by definition diverse. And that's something uniquely beautiful, I think, about the message of Jesus, right? Which is why you can have such incredible claims about people from every tribe and tongue. You can have incredible claims like the disciples spoke, and in the power of the Spirit, everyone heard in their own tongue. That they could simultaneously have a single message that simultaneously could be spoken in multiple ways, and can simultaneously be spoken back as praise. And that is in and of itself unifying without having to wash away difference. I just think that to me, and this says maybe more about me and my limitations, but it just seems obvious to me that unless we're wanting to say unity precedes diversity in the Trinity, which it's not clear that it does to me, that they just two necessarily go hand in hand, right? So if you have uniformity, you don't actually have unity. I would point as an example to, there's the book Silence, if you've heard of that one. Martin Scorsese made an excellent film of it. There's a subtext to it that I think is often missed, and that's, to me, the hinge of that story is when the Chancellor of Japan is speaking to, I always forget the priest's name, but the one who in the movie is played by Garfield. What's his first name? Andrew Garfield. And Andrew Garfield saying, you keep persecuting, and that's why people are falling away from the faith in Japan. And the Chancellor's laughing at him and saying, no, it never took root. It can't take root here. Japan's a swamp. And they're going back and forth. And you're sort of meant to be in this in-between of, on the one side you have a unity, and that unity is a uniformity. And that's pictured by the whole movie before that, where the Japanese converts were meeting secretly with these missionaries and Jesuit priests. Everything's being done in Latin. The Latin language, the Latin Mass. And it's very clear they have no idea what's being said. But there is a genuine piety. They really do believe. And that comes to a head right here, where that's basically what the Chancellor is calling him out for, saying, and he says, you haven't made them Christians, you made them Portuguese. And what you see from the movie moving forward after that, and in the book moving forward after that, is Garfield's character has to come to a realization that he needs to learn how to be a good Christian that's Japanese. And this is what he realizes his mentor, who supposedly has apostatized, is actually doing. He didn't apostatize at all. He had to humble himself. That's the coming down, so that he might come back up on the, what's it called? Started with an F. I don't remember the name of it. But the thing that he had to kneel down on. But it was a falling down. What is it? Fumiya, yeah. Where you fall down to get back up. But that falling down was a dying to himself as a Portuguese man, so that he could begin to say, what does it mean to be Christian here and now? Well, I think that's the subtext of that kind of unity was a uniformity, and that was dying, and they could crush that. But if they could actually begin to understand an indigenous vision of faith in Christ, then what you have here is another voice singing out, and now you really have something that can take root in Japan. That's a unity that inherently is diverse. So, hope that helps. Thank you guys all for coming. It was fun. I appreciate the questions and the work session.
All right, and thank you, Dr. Varma, for all of that. Just real quick, thank you all for coming. Just a couple remarks. Just a brief note about our group. We started out of a desire, the Student Justice Coalition started out of a desire to see the Moody community bring our faith to interact deeply with issues of modern justice. And our mission is to, stimulate and start dialogue among the student body to explore where justice and the Christian faith interact. So that's all what we're about. If you want to know more about us or are interested, feel free to, we have like a Google form for you to fill out information to be in contact with us. And we also have a code to our Instagram page at mbi.sjc. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Somebody asked when we meet. We don't necessarily have scheduled meetings, but we do have events that are planned to come later on this semester, so be on the lookout for those. But thank you all for coming. Also, we have stickers.